Here is something that kept me up at night. Why is it that desert soil from over 1,000 years ago could feed entire empires, sprawling cities full of families, children, and grandchildren, while the pampered soil in our own backyard sometimes gives up and dies after just 3 seasons? Think about that for a second. We have garden centers on every corner. We have fancy fertilizers. We have drip irrigation systems you can control from your phone. And yet, our soil is tired. Meanwhile, 2,000 years ago, a group of farmers in one of the harshest deserts on Earth grew lush olive groves, sprawling vineyards, and golden fields of wheat on the same patch of land for over 700 years straight. Recent dating by researchers at Ben-Gurion University using advanced luminescence testing on over 30 soil samples confirmed that these desert farms remained productive from roughly the 3rd century all the way to the 10th or 11th century. No breaks, no soil replacement, centuries of continuous harvests. And the secret ingredient they used? It costs absolutely nothing. You probably have dozens of them sitting in your yard right now. Stay with me today, because what I am about to share might just change the way you look at your garden forever. Welcome back to Rooted in Grace, my dear friends. I am so glad you are here. Grab your tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let us dig into one of the most fascinating gardening secrets I have ever come across. Part 1. The Magic of Lithic Mulch, a Forgotten Global History. Now, when I say the word mulch, what comes to mind? For most of us, it is wood chips, shredded bark, maybe golden straw spread around the rose bushes. Am I right? But here is something that surprised even me. What those ancient desert farmers used is something scientists today call lithic mulch agriculture. And in plain language, that simply means using stones, pebbles, and gravel to cover the surface of your soil. That is it. Rocks. This term was formally defined in a landmark study by Professor Dale Lightfoot, published in the Agricultural History Review. He spent years documenting every known case of this practice around the world, and what he found is remarkable. Here's the part that gave me chills the first time I read about it. This was not discovered by just one clever civilization. Professor Lightfoot confirmed it was independently invented by at least 3 completely separate cultures on different continents, separated by oceans and centuries. They never spoke to each other. They never traded notes. And yet, they all arrived at the exact same answer. My friends, when that happens in history, when people who have never met each other, living worlds apart, discover the same solution, that is the strongest proof we will ever get that it truly works. Let me walk you through these stories because each one is extraordinary. The Nabateans, Negev Desert, around 300 BC to 600 AD. Picture this. The Negev Desert in present-day Israel. The sun is absolutely punishing. The total rainfall for an entire year? About 4 inches, less than 150 millimeters. To put that in perspective, that is barely enough water to fill a single coffee mug. 1 mug for the whole year. And yet, the Nabatean people and their descendants grew grapes, olives, pomegranates, and even apples on this land. Archaeological research published by Ashkenazian colleagues in 2012 confirmed that at the height of their civilization, stone terraces became their primary dry farming technology, used continuously for centuries. No deep wells, no irrigation pipes, no chemical fertilizers shipped in from somewhere else. What they did was deceptively simple. They gathered limestone rocks and formed mounds. The local Arabic tradition calls them Tulaylat el-Anab, which translates to vine mounds. They placed these stones around their grapevines and olive trees, and the rocks did something miraculous. They captured the precious night dew and funneled it straight down to the roots. Now, some of you might wonder, did they really know what they were doing, or was it just luck? Well, here's the answer. In the 1950s, Professor Michael Evanari from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem actually rebuilt these ancient Nabatean farms in the desert. He published his findings in Scientific American, and they worked. The reconstructed farms produced crops just as they had 2,000 years ago. That is not folklore. That is science confirming history. We will get into exactly how the dew collection works in a moment, but first, let me take you halfway across the world. The Hohokam, Sonoran Desert, Arizona, 600 to 1400 AD. In the scorching Sonoran Desert of what is now Arizona, the Hohokam people faced a crisis that sounds all too familiar to many of us: erratic, unreliable rainfall and blistering heat. Their solution? They built tens of thousands of rock piles to cultivate the drought-tolerant agave plant. These were not decorations. Archaeological surveys conducted near Tumamoc Hill in Tucson documented enormous numbers of dry farming features: rock piles, check dams, contour terraces, and bordered gardens, dating back to around 850 to 1000 AD. A research paper by Hansen and his colleagues at Brigham Young University specifically studied these Hohokam rock piles and concluded that they acted as a type of mulch that harvested rainfall and retained soil moisture, allowing the Hohokam to intensively cultivate agaves even during multi-year droughts. Think about that. Multi-year droughts. And they kept growing food. With rocks. The Inca, Andes Mountains, Peru. And high up in the breathtaking peaks of the Andes, the great Inca civilization combined magnificent stone terracing with surface rock mulching to grow potatoes and quinoa at altitudes of 4,000 meters, where the temperature swings between blazing hot days and near freezing nights. The rocks buffered those extremes and kept the crops alive. Lanzarote, Canary Islands, 1730s to today. And one more story I absolutely love. On the island of Lanzarote in Spain's Canary Islands, something truly extraordinary happened. From 1730 to 1736, more than 30 volcanoes erupted, burying a quarter of the island under lava and ash, wiping out its most productive farmland. Most people would have given up. But the farmers there? They did something brilliant. They dug cone-shaped pits through the volcanic gravel, some as deep as 3 meters, to reach the buried soil, planted their grapevines, and built semicircular stone walls called zocos around each vine to shield it from the fierce Atlantic winds. Then they let the volcanic rock do the rest. And here is the truly astonishing part. In May 2025, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization officially recognized Lanzarote's volcanic farming system as a globally important agricultural heritage system, a GIAHS designation. Today, these traditional practices cover over 12,000 hectares and produce wine, fruits, cereals, and legumes in one of the driest regions of Europe, receiving less than 150 millimeters of rain per year, almost entirely without irrigation. As FAO Deputy Director Piedad Martin put it, Lanzarote is a prime example of adapting to extreme conditions. Lanzarote was also designated a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve back in 1993 for its exceptional agricultural innovation. So, 4 civilizations, 4 continents, multiple time periods, and every single one of them discovered the same thing. The most powerful mulch on Earth is free, it is permanent, and it has been sitting under our feet this whole time. Part 2. The Science. Why rocks quietly beat every mulch you can buy. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, okay, that is a nice history lesson, but does the actual science back this up? Oh, it does. And this is where it gets really good. Let me show you exactly why a simple pile of rocks outperforms the expensive bags of mulch we haul home from the garden center every spring. And honestly, this is the part that made me feel a little foolish for all the money I have spent over the years. The moisture secret. Organic mulches like wood chips and straw are wonderful. I am not knocking them. They hold moisture nicely. But here's the problem nobody tells you at the garden center. They decompose. Usually, within a year or two, they are gone. You are back at the store, buying more bags, hauling them home, spreading them all over again. A layer of stones works completely differently. Think of it as a one-way water valve. When rain falls, the water slips right through the gaps between the rocks and soaks into the soil. But when the hot sun comes out, that layer of rock breaks what scientists call the capillary action of the soil. It physically blocks the moisture from evaporating back up into the air. Now, here is where the science gets specific. Back in 1964, researchers Chiriki and colleagues conducted a 2-year field study and found that gravel mulch reduced evaporation by up to 40% and increased soil water storage by 45% compared to bare soil. A separate study by Corey and Kemper at Colorado State University in 1968 confirmed that gravel mulch outperformed even sawdust mulch of the same thickness at retaining moisture. And more recently, a 2024 study published in the Journal of Soil Science and Plant Nutrition tested different proportions of gravel coverage and found the effect was particularly dramatic on finer textured soils, the very type of clay-heavy soil many of us garden in. Let those numbers sink in. Your garden hose is working overtime, and a pile of free rocks is doing the job better. Nature's thermal battery. Here is something most gardeners do not realize. Organic mulches can actually keep your soil too cool in the spring, which delays seed germination. You are waiting and waiting for things to sprout, and the mulch is part of the problem. Rocks do something beautiful. They are nature's perfect thermal battery. During the day, they absorb the sun's heat, keeping the soil underneath cool and protected. Then, at night, when the temperature drops, they slowly release that stored warmth back into the earth. The Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory in Charlotte, North Carolina ran a fascinating study. They buried temperature sensors 3 inches below the soil surface under different mulch types and measured readings every 15 minutes from April through October. What they found was striking. Bare soil and turf grass showed temperature swings of over 21 degrees Fahrenheit during the day-night cycle. Mulched soils were far more stable. Gravel mulch in particular transferred warmth to the soil below, which the researchers noted may keep landscape plants in better overall health, especially in cold winter climates. A study by Fairborn, published in 1973 in the Agronomy Journal, confirmed exactly this. Soil temperatures were consistently higher under gravel mulch compared to bare soil, and crop yields increased as a direct result of the combined effect of more soil moisture and warmer temperatures. That is the difference between a seedling that makes it through a cold snap and one that does not. The self-watering miracle. Now, remember those Nabatean farmers in the desert? This is the part that absolutely fascinated me. They essentially designed a self-watering system over 2,000 years ago, using nothing but temperature and stone. Here's how it works. Rocks cool down much faster than soil at night. When the cool night air meets the cold surface of the stones, atmospheric moisture, the night dew, condenses right on the rock, just like water droplets forming on the outside of a cold glass of iced tea on a summer morning. Those droplets gather, trickle down between the stones, and drip gently into the soil. A comprehensive review of ancient atmospheric water harvesting techniques, covering methods from 5000 BC to the 1900s, found that ancient stone pile condensers could collect up to 360 liters per day, that is roughly 95 gallons. Modern dew collectors typically harvest between 0.3 and 0.6 liters per square meter per day. The stone method, perfected by the ancients, was remarkably effective. Every single morning, automatically, for free. No hose, no timer, no electricity. Thousands of years before we invented smart irrigation, they had already solved the problem. Erosion protection. If your garden is on even a slight slope, you know the heartbreak. One heavy rainstorm and your beautiful bark mulch washes right out of the beds, taking your topsoil with it. Rocks anchor the soil. They absorb the force of pounding raindrops, prevent soil crusting, and block wind and water from stealing your precious topsoil. A classic study by Adams in 1966, published by the Soil Science Society of America, specifically measured how different mulches affected runoff, erosion, and soil moisture depletion. His findings confirmed that stone-based mulches dramatically reduced soil loss, and work by Lamb and Chapman, published in the Journal of the American Society of Agronomy as far back as 1943, showed that surface stones significantly reduced erosion while simultaneously improving soil temperature and moisture, a triple benefit from a single, free material. On Lanzarote, the FAO noted that the volcanic gravel layer not only conserves moisture, but also protects the soil from erosion, excessive salinity, and sun exposure, all at once. The cost that cannot be beat. And here is the quiet truth that the mulch industry does not advertise. Organic mulch must be purchased and reapplied year after year. Synthetic plastic mulches suppress weeds for a season, sure, but they eventually break down into harmful microplastics that pollute our soils, and they cost money and labor to remove. A stone mulch? It costs $0. You lay it down once, and it lasts a lifetime. Colorado State University's Master Gardener program notes that stone mulch should be considered a permanent mulch for garden beds, and recommends stones smaller than ½ an inch in diameter for the best water conservation and weed suppression results. When was the last time something free did all of that? Part 3. Practical Guide. 4 easy ways to use rocks in your garden today. All right, my friends. I can almost hear some of you saying, well, I am not hauling boulders around my yard at my age. And you know what? You are absolutely right. You do not need to. You do not need heavy machinery. You do not need to spend a dime. You just need small stones, the kind that are probably already sitting in a corner of your garden right now. Let me give you 4 simple methods, and I promise any one of them is something you can do this weekend. Method 1. The Nabatean ring for trees and shrubs. If you have fruit trees, berry bushes, or drought-tolerant herbs like lavender and rosemary, this one is for you. Gather small gravel or pebbles, nothing fancy, just what you find, and spread a layer about 2 to 3 inches thick around the base of the plant, extending out a foot or 2 in every direction. One small but important detail: leave a tiny gap right at the trunk so the bark can breathe. Do not pile stones directly against the wood. Now, here is something interesting. A study published in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry tested 8 different mulch types on red maple trees over 2 years. The trees growing in pea gravel, crushed brick, and river rock had larger stem diameters than those in shredded bark. The researchers found that mineral mulches transferred heat to soils below, particularly in early spring, which likely gave those trees a growth advantage. Organic mulches actually kept the soil too cool for optimal growth. I tried this on a struggling rosemary bush last season, and within 3 weeks, it looked like a completely different plant. I could not believe it. Method 2. The Inca low wall for raised beds and vegetable patches. If you grow vegetables, this is a game changer. Take slightly larger stones, about the size of your fist, and stack them into a low wall, just 8 to 12 inches high, along the northern or western edge of your garden bed. During the day, that little wall soaks up the sunshine. At night, it blocks cold wind and radiates a gentle, protective heat over your fragile seedlings. It is like giving your plants a warm blanket when they need it most. This is exactly the principle behind the Lanzarote zocos, those semicircular stone walls the farmers build around each vine. On an island blasted by constant trade winds, those simple stone crescents create a protected microclimate that makes agriculture possible in conditions that would otherwise kill the plants. This is wonderfully effective for winter greens and early spring sprouts. You will be harvesting weeks before your neighbors even plant. Method 3. The potted plant trick, the hidden secret. This one is almost too simple. If you garden in pots on your patio, or even with indoor houseplants, just place 3 to 5 small stones on the surface of the potting soil. That is it. Those few stones will disrupt evaporation and reduce how often you need to water. Remember what the researchers found. Gravel disrupts capillary action, which is the main mechanism that pulls moisture out of your pots. A University of Florida study using lysimeters confirmed that even standard mulch reduces soil water loss from evaporation by about 33%. With stones, which do not decompose or absorb water themselves, the effect can be even more sustained. This is especially wonderful for herbs like basil, mint, and thyme, and it works beautifully for succulents too. Method 4. The gravel path, microclimate magic. If you have pathways between your garden beds, here is a trick most people never think of. Lay down a layer of crushed gravel or pebbles instead of wood chips or grass. That gravel path becomes a giant thermal battery running right through the center of your garden. It absorbs heat all day and radiates gentle warmth all evening. The plants on either side of the path will bask in that extra warmth, and you will be picking tomatoes and peppers much later into autumn than you ever thought possible. Gardening experts note that placing heat-absorbing materials like stones and gravel near your plants effectively creates a warming zone. Some gardeners have found this can extend the growing season by 2 to 4 weeks on either end. That is, up to 2 extra months of harvest from a free pathway. Part 4. Rock dust. The nutrition secret hiding in every stone. Now we come to the part that truly blew my mind, and I suspect it might surprise you too. The benefits of rocks in the garden are not just physical. They are not just about moisture and temperature. Rocks are actually nutritional. Every single stone in your garden is, quite literally, an unopened bag of slow-release fertilizer. Let me explain. Think about the most fertile, lush, impossibly green places on Earth. The rich valleys of Java, the tropical paradise of Costa Rica, the Hawaiian Islands, the vibrant vineyards of Lanzarote. What do they all have in common? They are all born from volcanoes and glaciers. When glaciers move, they crush rocks into fine powder called glacial moraine. When volcanoes erupt, they bring deep earth minerals to the surface. And these geological processes create soil that is absolutely bursting with life. Here's the part that should trouble every gardener. Modern agriculture has been feeding our plants a fast food diet. Just nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium over and over. That is like feeding your grandchildren nothing but bread, sugar, and water, and wondering why they are not thriving. We have completely ignored the complex trace elements that plants need for true health and disease resistance. But science is now catching up to what the ancients knew. A major review published in 2021 in the journal Science of the Total Environment analyzed 48 crop trials using ground silicate rock powders, essentially rock dust, and found beneficial results, particularly from mafic rocks like basalt. The review confirmed that rock dust can replenish depleted macro and micronutrients, and noted that silicon supplied by the rocks can trigger a broad spectrum of plant resistance to both pests and disease. And the numbers are staggering. A controlled study published in the Journal of Cleaner Production found that basalt rock dust increased available phosphorus in the soil by 20 times, potassium by 10 times, calcium by 15 times, and magnesium by 13 times compared to untreated soil. Maize and bean plants grown in the enriched soil showed nutrient accumulations up to 5 times higher than those without rock dust. Another study found that adding basalt dust to crop fields increased yield by about 21% and allowed plants to absorb 26% more silicon, which strengthened their stems and improved resistance to fungal diseases and pest damage. Scientists call this soil remineralization, and it is nature's own slow-release fertilizer. It feeds the microscopic life in the earth, which in turn feeds your plants. This is exactly why those ancient fields of the Hohokam and the Nabateans stayed productive for centuries without a single drop of artificial fertilizer. The stones themselves were feeding the earth, endlessly, quietly, for free. And you can do this at home very easily. If you can get your hands on any leftover rock dust or crushed gravel, maybe from a driveway project or a local quarry, sprinkle a few handfuls of basalt or granite dust into your compost pile or directly onto your garden beds. Analysis shows basalt is naturally high in silica at about 44%, iron oxide at 11%, and calcium oxide at 9%, with dozens of trace elements making up the rest. Most gardeners who use rock dust reapply only every 3 to 5 years because of how slowly and steadily it releases. Over the next 6 to 12 months, the soil microbes will begin breaking it down, naturally remineralizing your soil and bringing it back to vibrant, abundant life. Part 5. What we have forgotten and why it matters now. My friends, let me be honest with you for a moment. We live in a world that has built a multi-billion-dollar mulch industry. Every year, we spend enormous amounts of money, fuel, and energy to manufacture, bag, ship, and buy materials that are designed to decay, forcing us to buy them all over again the very next season. In commercial farming, we lay down thousands of miles of petroleum-based plastic mulch. It stops weeds for a season, yes, but it leaves behind a toxic legacy of microplastics that suffocate the earth, and it costs a fortune in labor and landfill fees to remove. We have spent fortunes trying to invent complex solutions to problems that the earth itself solved for free over 1,000 years ago. And as our climate shifts, as droughts grow longer, as summer heat grows fiercer, the wisdom of those ancient desert farmers is calling out to us across the centuries. They faced harsh, unforgiving conditions, and instead of fighting nature, they partnered with it. They looked down at the stony ground and saw not a curse, but a profound blessing. As one Lanzarote farmer, Ascension Robena, told FAO researchers when her island's farming system received its Global Heritage designation, these techniques safeguard knowledge that is vital at a time when food must be produced under increasingly extreme weather conditions. You know, there is a beautiful lesson in this for our own lives, too. Sometimes the things we see as obstacles, the hard, rocky, difficult seasons we go through, are actually the very things that build our resilience, our stability, our hidden strength. Just as a hard stone slowly weathers over time to release life-giving minerals into the soil, the weathering we endure through the seasons of our lives releases something precious too. A deep, rich wisdom, a patience, a grace that only time and experience can reveal. We hold trace elements of kindness, of love, of hard-won understanding, and the people around us are nourished by it, whether we realize it or not. So here is my gentle invitation to you today. When you step outside into the fresh air this week, do not rush out and buy anything. Instead, take a slow, peaceful walk around your garden. Find 10 ordinary stones. Just 10. Remember, Colorado State University says stones smaller than half an inch work best, so you do not need anything big. Bring them back and arrange them lovingly around the base of your favorite plant. Maybe a struggling shrub, maybe a tired old rose that could use some help. Leave them there and watch. Over the next 30 days, watch as the soil beneath those stones stays damp. Watch as the roots find cool shelter from the afternoon sun. Watch as that plant begins to quietly thrive under the ancient protection of something that costs nothing at all. The freest thing in all of nature, a simple rock, was once humanity's most powerful agricultural tool. And it still is. We do not always need to buy the newest, most expensive thing. Sometimes, we just need to be still, be observant, and be humble enough to relearn what the wise people before us already knew. If this surprised you as much as it surprised me, I would love it if you shared this video with a friend who gardens. And if you're new here, welcome. We talk about things like this every week. Hit that subscribe button so we can keep growing together. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. May your hands be happily covered in soil. May your garden be a place of peace. And may your heart be forever rooted in grace. Until next time, God bless you and happy gardening.